and who gets all blushes and like is all, you know, embarrassed and overwhelmed by this like figure of celestial beauty, and decides to cooperate. The conscience decides to cooperate and gets some responsibility, and so the fairy allows the puppet to move without strings. So that's kind of interesting. So it's the intervention of nature. Culture focuses the aim, then it's the intervention of nature that produces the autonomy. And that seems to be right. I mean, even though it's not that understandable, it seems to be right. And then, so she takes the strings off Pinocchio. And you might say, well, that's partly because your child is certainly not just a creature of culture. By no means. Your child has a temperament. You'll see that right away. And that temperament will unfold. And hopefully it'll unfold in a cultural context that's amenable to it. And that the combination of those two things will produce something new. He can talk. He can walk. And so the good fairy basically tells him that he's got a bit of autonomy, and now it's up to him to like clue in a bit and act properly and learn the difference between good and evil and to speak truthfully and all that. It's a bit propagandistic, that part of the movie, I would say, but it doesn't really matter. It's kind of inculcation of conventional morality, and there's a fair bit to it, especially that he's supposed to tell the truth. And you know, he says he will, and the cricket's listening, and then the puppet asks, well, what does conscience mean? Because the fairy says, always let your conscience be your guide. And he says, well, what does conscience mean? And then the bug, who's like all puffed up because he wants to impress the fairy, pops down and gets on his little matchbox and gives this like horrible little lecture about how to behave properly. That's just like ideological chatter. You can hardly even stand listening to it. And it's supposed to be like that. It's generic moral advice that anyone could give that's kind of dull and also puffed up and grandiose, and he's just not very good at it. So, and that's why he's on his little matchbox there with his chest puffed out. And so he says, that's just the trouble with the world today. And I think that's his opening line, you know, that he's diagnosing the whole world. And you know, the fairy, she thinks he's kind of funny because he is. And you know, it's sort of, there's a real interesting thing here going on, because he's male and he's all puffed up with his knowledge, which is completely shallow, and then he's put in contact with this like celestial feminine ideal, and he just turns into a complete moron. And that's exactly what happens to men. It happens to them all the time. So anyways, she decides to give him a chance and turns him into this conscience, and all of a sudden he's this like 1920s millionaire. So he's been ennobled. But then she tells him that, you know, he has to journey along with Pinocchio in order for things to go properly, and he promises that he'll be a good conscience and do it, and he already thinks that he can do it, and that's why he's on the matchbox podium, you know, espousing his morality. But the reality turns out to be much more complex. So the bug has a little talk with the cricket. The bug has a little talk with the puppet, and the bug tries to tell Pinocchio explicitly what it means to be good, and he gets completely tangled up in the explanation, because what the hell does he know? And the puppet doesn't understand anything that he says anyways. And so there's a message there, and the message is the kind of knowledge that the conscience and the puppet are supposed to co-create is not something that you can articulate easily as a table of rules. It's not like that, because life is too complicated to just have 5 rules that you live by and that will solve every problem. Partly because the rules will conflict. That's a huge part of the problem, right? One moral guideline contradicts another in a situation. It's like, you don't know what to do. So anyways, they decide that they're just going to, Pinocchio says, well, I'll be a good boy. And the cricket says, well, that's the spirit. And then, well, then Geppetto gets wind of it, and they have a little like horror episode, and then he finds out that the puppet is autonomous, and they have a little party, which tells you exactly what Geppetto's up to. Is the autonomy emerges, and he's happy about it. So it's stamping home the notion that Geppetto is in fact a good guy, and that is in fact what he wants. So it's like the encouragement of your father is a precondition for the emergence of your individuality, and it also allows the feminine to play a role, both as nature and perhaps as mother. And the combination of those two things produces the autonomous individual. It's like, well, that seems perfectly reasonable. So off they go to sleep. Next day they wake up and it's a new day, and Pinocchio is off to school, and that's a good thing too, because Geppetto isn't, and he's really excited about it. And so what that means is that he's been parented properly, and he's going to go out into the world of his peers, which is where he belongs, and Geppetto isn't too worried about it. In fact, he's pushing him out the door, you know, it's like, go, you can do it, this is the next thing. The kid isn't cowering in the corner and overcome by terror, and with the parents freaking out about all the things that are going to go wrong. There's some faith in his ability. So he sees all the kids wandering by, and Geppetto dresses him up and sends him off to school. And so that's good. So that's a happy family story. It's like mom and dad got together, they decided that the kid was going to, you know, be competent and autonomous and ready to face the world, and so out he goes. And so he's like 5 years old at this point or something like that, and that's where we're at in the story. And I think that's a good place to stop, because the next thing that happens is anomaly, essentially. It's like Pinocchio goes off to be a good boy, but it turns out that that's a hell of a lot more complicated than he might think, because there are actually complications in the world, but also malevolence, right? The desire for things not to go right. There are people who are not oriented towards the ideal in any way at all. And Pinocchio's young and naive, and so he has no defense whatsoever against this malevolence, and that's, you know, that's not unexpected. And it also turns out that the conscience, the cricket, who is still not very clued in, oversleeps. And so he's just not there at a critical moment. But I think we'll pick that up next week, because this is a good point in the plot to stop. The child has entered the broader world and has to cope with it. And so he's prepared because he had a wonderful father and he had a magical mother, and so he's as prepared as you can be. He's not even completely a marionette anymore. But now it's up to him. That's the thing. Now it's up to him. His parents have done basically what they could. And that's really about right, you know. It's wise, I would say, psychologically. So, all right. That's that.